The morning sun filtered through the crystal windows of Nexus Academy, casting rainbow patterns across the polished floors. Students from dozens of species moved through the corridors with the careful grace that came from sharing space with beings who could accidentally kill each other with a careless gesture. Marcus Chin walked among them like a mountain moving through butterflies. At 6 feet tall and weighing 200 pounds, he was considered massive by galactic standards. His heavy footsteps echoed despite his attempts to walk softly, and other students instinctively gave him a wide berth. Not out of fear exactly, but out of the same caution one might show around a friendly but enormous predator. The Nexus Academy was the pride of the Galactic Educational Consortium, a place where the brightest young minds from across the galaxy came to learn. It floated in the void between star systems, a neutral ground where no single species held dominance. The architecture reflected this philosophy. Curved walls that accommodated the Zephyrian preference for rounded spaces, adjustable gravity fields for species from different worlds, and atmospheric processors that could shift the air composition from room to room. Marcus had been attending for 3 months now, ever since humanity had been granted provisional membership in the consortium. He was one of only 12 humans scattered across various galactic institutions, serving as both students and ambassadors for his species. The responsibility weighed on him, but not as heavily as the constant awareness that everyone around him was fragile. His roommate, Clix, was a perfect example. The Zenthari stood barely 4 feet tall, with crystalline skin that could shatter if struck too hard, and hollow bones that made him lighter than a human child. Clix's species had evolved on a low-gravity world with no large predators, and their technology had eliminated violence from their society thousands of years ago. The concept of physical conflict was as foreign to them as breathing underwater was to humans. "Marcus, you're early again," Clix said as Marcus entered their shared dormitory room. The Zenthari was arranging his study materials with precise, delicate movements. Everything about Clix was precise and delicate. It had to be in a world where clumsiness meant death. "Couldn't sleep," Marcus replied, which wasn't entirely true. He'd been awake for hours, doing the exercises his military father had taught him, keeping his reflexes sharp. Old habits died hard, even in a place dedicated to peace and learning. Marcus had tried to explain human history to Clix once. The wars, the violence, the constant struggle for survival that had shaped their evolution. Clix had listened with the polite attention of someone hearing about a particularly disturbing work of fiction. The Zenthari simply couldn't comprehend a species that had survived by becoming better at killing than anything else on their planet. "Advanced xenobiology this morning," Clix reminded him, his voice carrying the musical quality common to his species. Professor Yith promised to discuss the fascinating reproductive cycles of the mollusk worlds. Marcus nodded, gathering his own materials. Professor Yith was a gastropoid, a slug-like being whose species found violence so abhorrent that they became physically ill at the mere mention of conflict. Most of the faculty were from similarly peaceful species. The galactic consensus was that education should be handled by those who had evolved beyond primitive aggressive impulses. The classroom was a marvel of adaptive architecture. Seats could adjust to accommodate the gas bags of the Aryans, the rocky bulk of the Siliconites, or the liquid-filled tanks needed by the aquatic depths. The temperature, gravity, and atmosphere were carefully controlled to create a compromise environment where all species could function, if not thrive. Marcus took his usual seat near the back, a reinforced chair designed to handle his excessive mass. Around him, his classmates settled in with the gentle movements of beings who had never known predation. The felinoids moved with fluid grace, but no urgency. The avians preened their decorative plumage with no thought of camouflage or threat display. Even the reptilian scales basked under heat lamps with the contentment of a species that had never been prey. Professor Yith oozed into the room, leaving a trail of luminescent mucus that would dry and flake away within hours. Her lecture today covered the complex mating rituals of a species that reproduced through synchronized dream dancing. It was fascinating in an academic sense, but Marcus found his mind wandering to the defensive possibilities of the classroom. 3 exits, but the main door was the only one wide enough for rapid evacuation. Windows that were decorative rather than functional, The classroom was in the middle of the station, surrounded by other rooms. Ceiling height adequate for most species, but would limit movement for the taller ones. Desks that could provide cover, but were made of lightweight materials that wouldn't stop much. He caught himself cataloging threats and forced his attention back to the lecture. This was the galaxy's greatest center of learning, protected by layers of security and diplomatic immunity. The most dangerous thing in the room was probably him. That thought was interrupted by a soft chime from the classroom's communication system. Professor Yith paused mid-sentence, her eye stalks swiveling toward the speaker. A message scrolled across the room's display screens in the flowing script of Galactic Standard. Security alert. Unauthorized entity detected in Section 7. All students and faculty remain in current locations until further notice. This is a precautionary measure. A ripple of concern passed through the class, but it was the mild worry of beings who had never experienced real danger. The Zinthri students exchanged glances, wondering if this might be some kind of drill. The Felinoids twitched their ears in curiosity. Professor Yith made a soothing gesture with one of her tentacles. "I'm sure it's nothing serious," she said in her bubbling voice. "Perhaps someone simply took a wrong turn. The station's security systems are quite thorough." Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the feeling of a threat he couldn't see or define. His human instincts were screaming that something was wrong, but he couldn't explain why to beings who had no such instincts. Around him, his classmates continued their casual chatter about the interrupted lecture. 10 minutes passed. Then, 20. The soft murmur of voices gradually died away as even the most trusting species began to sense that something was amiss. Professor Yith had contacted the administration twice, receiving only vague assurances that the situation would be resolved shortly. Marcus found himself listening to sounds beyond the classroom. The hum of air recyclers, the distant vibration of the station's engines, the soft footsteps of other species in nearby corridors. Everything seemed normal, but the wrongness in his gut only grew stronger. Another chime, this one with a different tone. The display screens flickered and went dark for a moment before showing a new message. Security alert updated. Hostile entity confirmed in Section 7. All personnel maintain lockdown positions. Security forces responding. Now the real fear began. Marcus watched his classmates as the reality of the word hostile penetrated their peaceful worldview. The Zinthri began to show stress fractures in their crystalline skin. The Felinoid's casual grace became rigid with tension. Even the slug-like Professor Yith seemed to shrink into herself. "What does hostile mean in this context?" asked Vera, one of the Aryans. Her gas-filled body bobbed nervously near the ceiling. "Surely it's just a misunderstanding?" Marcus almost laughed at the innocence of the question. "How did you explain hostility to a species that communicated through shared atmospheric pressure changes and had never experienced individual conflict? How did you describe violence to beings whose idea of aggression was a strongly worded academic disagreement?" "Perhaps we should contact our families," suggested Clix, his voice carrying harmonics of distress. "My parents should know where I am." "The communication systems are likely blocked during a security event," Marcus said quietly. "Standard protocol." Everyone turned to look at him. He realized he'd spoken with the authority of someone who actually knew about security protocols, something that marked him as distinctly other in this gathering of peaceful scholars. Professor Yitha's tentacles writhed nervously. "Marcus, you seem familiar with these procedures?" He nodded slowly. "My species has experience with security situations." It was the most diplomatic way he could phrase it. Humanity had experience with security situations the way fish had experience with water. Every human child learned about lockdown procedures, escape routes, and threat assessment before they learned to read. It was as natural as breathing to a species that had clawed its way to the top of a world full of things trying to kill them. Another 20 minutes passed in increasingly tense silence. The third chime, when it came, carried a tone Marcus recognized even if his classmates didn't. The sharp, urgent blast of immediate danger. "Emergency alert. Hostile entity has breached containment. Section 7 evacuation in progress. All other sections maintain lockdown. Do not attempt to assist security forces." The fear in the room became palpable. Several Zinthri students began to show hairline cracks across their bodies, a stress response that could become dangerous if it continued. The felinoids pressed themselves against the walls, their decorative plumage flattened against their bodies. Professor Yitha's mucus trail became more pronounced as her stress pheromones activated. "What kind of hostile entity?" whispered Tim. "A human-like proximan whose species had evolved on a world so gentle that their worst predator had been a creature roughly equivalent to an earth rabbit." Marcus was wondering the same thing, but for different reasons. The station's security was designed to handle diplomatic incidents, maybe a brawl between incompatible species, possibly even a mental health crisis. What could have gotten past all of that to be labeled hostile and require containment? The lights flickered, and the gravity field wavered slightly, something that should have been impossible with the station's redundant systems. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in a red glow that made the peaceful classroom look like the inside of a predator's mouth. "Systems malfunction," Professor Yith said, but her voice wavered. Even she was beginning to understand that this was beyond normal parameters. Marcus stood up, his movement causing several nearby students to flinch. At his full height, with the emergency lighting casting harsh shadows across his features, he looked every inch the apex predator his species had evolved to be. But his voice was calm, controlled. "We need to prepare for the possibility that whatever's happening might reach this section," he said. "But the security forces," began Clicks. "Might not be enough," Marcus finished. "We should identify potential defensive positions and escape routes." The room fell silent. The concept of preparing to defend themselves was so alien to most of his classmates that they couldn't even process it. These were beings whose ancestors had developed philosophy, art, and mathematics while Marcus's ancestors were learning to nap flint and hunt mammoths. Professor Yith made a sound like air escaping from a punctured container. "Marcus, I appreciate your instincts, but surely the proper response is to remain calm and trust in the authorities?" Before Marcus could respond, a new sound echoed through the station's corridors, something that made his blood run cold, and every predator instinct in his body snapped to full alert. It was a sound that shouldn't exist in this peaceful place, a sound that belonged to the violent corners of the galaxy, where civilized species rarely ventured. The hunting cry of a void stalker. Marcus had heard recordings of that sound during his xenobiology prep courses, but hearing it filtered through speakers hadn't prepared him for the reality. It was a noise designed by evolution to freeze prey in terror, to trigger every flight instinct that billions of years of natural selection had bred into living creatures. It echoed through the station's corridors, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The effect on his classmates was immediate and devastating. The Zinthari students' stress fractures widened, threatening to shatter their bodies entirely. The felinoids went rigid, their eyes wide with primordial fear. Several of the more delicate species simply collapsed, overwhelmed by terror so pure and primal that their nervous systems couldn't process it. But Marcus didn't freeze. Marcus didn't run. Every muscle in his body tensed, every sense sharpened to diamond clarity. But he remained standing, thinking, planning. Because that was what humans did when faced with a predator. They became better predators. "Everyone away from the doors," he said, his voice cutting through the paralysis that had gripped the room. "Now." Professor Yith started to object, but Marcus was already moving. He grabbed the nearest desk, a delicate construction designed for beings who weighed less than 100 pounds, and flipped it with casual strength that sent several students scurrying backward. The desk's metal legs buckled under forces it was never designed to handle, but Marcus quickly straightened them into crude spears. "What are you doing?" gasped Vera, her gas-filled body pulsing with distress. "Making weapons," Marcus replied, testing the point of one improvised spear against his thumb. A drop of red blood welled up. In a room full of beings with clear or colorless circulatory fluids, it looked shockingly vivid. The hunting cry echoed again, closer this time, and Marcus felt his pupils dilate as adrenaline flooded his system. Around him, the most advanced minds in the galaxy cowered in instinctive terror, but he felt only the cold clarity that had carried his species through 100,000 years of being the thing that other things feared. "A void stalker," he said, mostly to himself. How the hell did a void stalker get onto a diplomatic station? But even as he asked the question, he was thinking through the implications. Void Stalkers were apex predators from the galactic rim, creatures that hunted in the spaces between stars. They were intelligent, adaptable, and absolutely lethal to any species that hadn't evolved in an environment of constant threat. More importantly, they couldn't survive in normal atmospheric conditions. They needed the specialized life support systems found on only the most advanced ships. Someone had brought it here. Someone had released it. This wasn't an accident or a containment failure. This was an attack. The realization sent ice through his veins, but also brought a grim satisfaction. After 3 months of walking on eggshells around beings who could be injured by a careless gesture, after endlessly moderating his strength and his instincts and his very nature, Marcus was finally facing a problem that required exactly what he was, a killer from a death world who had survived because his ancestors were better at violence than anything else in their environment. The hunting cry sounded a third time, and Marcus heard something else underneath it, the soft whisper of claws on metal, moving through the station's ventilation system. Getting closer, he looked around the classroom one more time, noting the exits, the cover, the potential weapons. Then, he looked at his classmates, brilliant, peaceful, utterly defenseless beings who represented the best their species had to offer. "It's coming," he said quietly. And for the first time since arriving at Nexus Academy, Marcus Chin smiled the smile of an apex predator who had just caught the scent of prey. The silence that followed the third hunting cry was worse than any sound. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat, steady and strong, while around him the terrified breathing of his classmates created a symphony of fear. The emergency lighting painted everything in shades of blood and shadow, transforming the peaceful classroom into something from humanity's oldest nightmares. Professor Yith had retreated to the farthest corner, her slug-like body leaving a trail of stress pheromones that made several students even more agitated. The Zenthari were clustering together, their crystalline bodies chiming softly as stress fractures spread across their surfaces. Marcus knew that if those cracks reached critical depth, the students would literally shatter from fear. "Professor," Marcus said quietly, "I need you to activate the emergency communication system." "The systems are locked down," she began. "Override it." His tone carried an authority that made her tentacles twitch. "Send a message to security. Tell them we have a confirmed Void Stalker in the ventilation system, moving towards Section 4. Tell them." He paused, calculating. "Tell them students are in immediate danger and may require evacuation." "How can you possibly know?" Another sound cut through the air, the metallic scrape of claws against ventilation grills, directly above their heads. Several students looked up in terror, as if the ceiling had become transparent and revealed the monster stalking them. Marcus didn't look up. He was listening to the pattern of movement, tracking the creature's progress through the air ducts. "Because I'm a human," he said simply. "And humans are very good at hunting things, even things that hunt us." The scraping moved away, heading toward the main corridor. Marcus relaxed slightly, not because the danger had passed, but because he now knew where it was going. The creature was following the ventilation system toward the central hub, where the highest concentration of potential prey would be gathered. "It's looking for a crowd," he murmured, then, louder, "Professor," that communication. Now, Professor Yitha's tentacles danced over her desk interface, triggering emergency protocols that had probably never been used outside of drills. Marcus watched her work while part of his mind continued tracking the sounds from above. The Void Stalker was moving with purpose, not randomly, which meant it had intelligence, planning capability, and, most troubling of all, some knowledge of the station's layout. "The message is sent," Professor Yith reported, her voice barely above a whisper. "Security acknowledges. They say to maintain position and await extraction." Marcus nodded, but his attention was elsewhere. The scratching sounds had stopped, which could mean the creature had reached its destination or found another route. In the sudden silence, he became aware of something else. The soft hum of the air recycling system had changed pitch. Subtle, but noticeable to someone trained to recognize environmental changes. "The air system," he said. "It's been modified." Clix looked up from where he'd been trying to comfort a terrified Aryan student. "Modified how?" Marcus moved to the nearest wall panel, studying the atmosphere display. The readouts were complex, designed to show the precise mixture of gases needed to support dozens of different species simultaneously. But Marcus had spent months learning to read these displays, and what he saw now made his blood run cold. The oxygen levels are being slowly reduced, he said, and something else is being introduced. Something that's not on the standard atmospheric chart. Understanding dawned in Professor Yitha's large eyes. A sedative, or worse. Worse, Marcus confirmed grimly. Void stalkers don't need their prey unconscious. They prefer them aware, but paralyzed. Fear enhances the taste. Several students made sounds of distress at this revelation. The concept of being eaten alive was so foreign to their experiences that some couldn't even properly process it. But Marcus could see the reality settling in. Their peaceful world of academic discourse and philosophical debate had been invaded by something from the dark spaces between stars, something that existed only to kill and consume. "We need to get out of here," said Tim, the Proximant student. His human-like features were pale with terror, but at least he was thinking clearly. Before whatever it's pumping into the air takes effect, Marcus was already moving toward the classroom's emergency supply cabinet. Every room in the station was equipped with basic survival gear, breathing masks, emergency rations, medical supplies. It was another sign of the galaxy's civilized nature that such preparations were seen as courteous rather than necessary. Breathing masks for everyone, he ordered, distributing the equipment with military efficiency. Full seal, maximum filtration. And someone help the students who can't manage the controls. The masks were designed for emergency situations like hull breaches or atmospheric contamination, but they would work against whatever toxin the Void Stalker was using. Marcus fitted his own mask and immediately noticed the difference. The air inside was clean and sharp, free of the subtle chemical tang that had been growing stronger. "How long will they last?" asked Vera, her gas-filled body now constrained within a larger mask assembly. 6 hours, Marcus replied. "Longer if we stay calm and don't exert ourselves." He didn't mention that 6 hours might be 5 hours and 50 minutes longer than they had to live. The breathing masks would protect them from the atmospheric toxins, but they wouldn't stop claws or teeth. For that, they needed something else entirely. Marcus began moving through the classroom systematically, gathering anything that could be used as a weapon or defensive tool. The desk legs he'd already modified were a start, but they would need more. Much more. "Help me," he called to the students who seemed most capable of movement. "We need barriers, weapons, anything that can slow down a predator." The response was mixed. Some students, particularly those from species with at least some survival instincts, began helping him overturn desks and arrange them into defensive positions. Others remained paralyzed by the impossibility of their situation. Their minds simply couldn't accept that they might need to fight for their lives. Click surprised Marcus by being among the most helpful. Despite his fragile, crystalline body, the Xanthari student seemed to understand the gravity of their situation. He worked carefully but efficiently, using his species' precise motor control to create complex interlocking barriers from classroom furniture. "I have been researching human history," Click said quietly as they worked. "Your species has survived many extinction events. Perhaps you can teach us to survive this one." Marcus paused in his work, struck by the simple trust in his roommate's voice. Clix wasn't just asking for protection. He was asking to learn, to understand how a peaceful being might become something capable of violence when survival demanded it. "First lesson," Marcus said, testing the stability of their makeshift barricade. "Violence isn't about anger or hatred. It's about solving problems. Right now, our problem is a predator that wants to kill us. The solution is to make killing us more difficult than finding easier prey." He gestured to their defensive positions, desks arranged to create choke points, improvised weapons distributed throughout the room, clear lines of sight to all potential entry points. It wasn't sophisticated, but it would force the creature to work for its kill. "Second lesson," he continued, "predators are lazy. They want easy meals, not challenging fights. If we make ourselves difficult enough to kill, it might move on to softer targets." Several students exchanged glances at this. The idea of hoping the monster would kill someone else instead of them was morally troubling to beings raised in peaceful societies. But Marcus could see understanding beginning to dawn in their eyes. This wasn't about morality anymore. This was about survival, and survival had its own rules. A new sound echoed through the station, the sharp crack of breaking metal, followed by terrified screams from somewhere in the distance. The Void Stalker had found prey, and it wasn't being subtle about its attack. The screams cut off abruptly, leaving only the station's emergency klaxons and the sound of his classmates' terrified breathing. "It's feeding," Marcus said quietly. "That gives us maybe 20 minutes before it starts hunting again." Professor Yith made a sound like escaping gas. 20 minutes until what? Until it comes looking for dessert. Marcus moved to the classroom's main door, studying the control panel. The lockdown had engaged physical barriers as well as electronic ones. Thick metal plates had slid into place over the standard entry, turning the room into a bunker. But every bunker could become a trap if the enemy found the right approach. "Can these barriers be opened from the outside?" he asked Professor Yith. "Only with command authorization or—" She paused, understanding the implications. "Or by bypassing the physical locks. But that would require considerable force." Marcus nodded grimly. The barriers would slow the creature down, but they wouldn't stop it permanently. Void Stalkers were known for their ability to adapt, to find weaknesses in any defense. Given enough time, it would find a way in. "Professor, I need to know everything about this station's layout," he said. "Ventilation, maintenance tunnels, secondary access points. Everything. I don't have that information. I'm just a biology instructor." "Then, access it through your terminal. Use your faculty codes." Professor Yith hesitated, her tentacles writhing nervously. "Marcus, what are you planning?" He turned to look at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her recoil. It was the look of a predator calculating angles of attack, weighing risks and benefits with cold mathematical precision. It was a look that belonged in the dark spaces between stars, not in a classroom full of young scholars. "I'm planning to kill it before it kills us," he said simply. The room fell silent except for the soft hiss of breathing masks and the distant sounds of the station's emergency systems. Marcus could feel the weight of 30 pairs of eyes on him, beings from a dozen different species, all looking to the human for salvation from a nightmare that their peaceful civilizations had never prepared them to face. "You can't possibly fight a Void Stalker," whispered Tim. "They're apex predators. They hunt in vacuum. Their natural prey includes species far more dangerous than humans." Marcus smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Their natural prey are species that evolved in environments where they had no natural enemies. Species that developed intelligence and technology without ever learning to fight. Species like all of yours." He gestured around the room, taking in the terrified faces of his classmates. "But humans didn't evolve that way. We came from a world where everything was trying to kill us, where we had to become better killers than anything else on our planet just to survive long enough to reproduce. We didn't develop technology to explore the universe. We developed it to kill things more efficiently." The words hung in the air like a challenge to the galaxy's civilized order. These students had been raised to believe that intelligence transcended violence, that wisdom could overcome aggression, that evolution naturally led toward peace. Marcus was telling them that their entire worldview was wrong, that the most dangerous thing in the galaxy wasn't some monster from the void, but the species sitting among them in a classroom, pretending to be civilized. "The human death world hypothesis," murmured Clix, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and terror. "We studied it in xenobiology, but I thought it was just academic speculation." "It's not speculation," Marcus replied. "It's reality. And right now, it's the only thing standing between you and becoming something's dinner." Another sound echoed through the station, the grinding of metal being forced apart. Somewhere, the Void Stalker was working its way through the station's defenses, methodically hunting its way toward their location. It knew they were here. It could probably smell their fear through the air recycling system, taste their terror in the electromagnetic fields generated by their nervous systems. Marcus moved to Professor Yith's terminal and began accessing the station's blueprint database. His fingers moved over the controls with practiced efficiency, another skill that marked him as distinctly other in this gathering of peaceful scholars. Within minutes, he had a complete map of their section displayed on the main screen. "There," he said, pointing to a secondary access tunnel that ran behind their classroom. Maintenance corridor. Wide enough for a void stalker, direct access to the air recycling systems, and it bypasses all the main security barriers. Professor Yith studied the display with growing alarm. If it finds that route, it will, Marcus said with certainty. Void stalkers are intelligent hunters. It's probably already mapping the station's infrastructure, looking for exactly this kind of weakness. We have maybe 10 minutes before it arrives. He turned to face his classmates, these brilliant young minds who had never faced real danger in their lives. They were looking at him with a mixture of hope and terror, waiting for him to solve their problem with the same calm efficiency he'd shown with everything else. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a species that had fought its way to the top of a world full of monsters. "We're going to turn this classroom into a killing ground. And when that thing comes through that tunnel, we're going to teach it why you don't hunt humans." The words should have been reassuring, but instead they sent a chill through the room. Because for the first time since the crisis began, Marcus Chin wasn't pretending to be a peaceful student. He was letting his true nature show, the nature of a species that had survived by becoming the most efficient killers their world had ever produced. And in the red glow of the emergency lighting, surrounded by the most advanced minds in the galaxy, the human from the Deathworld began to plan a murder. Marcus moved through the classroom with the methodical precision of a battlefield engineer, transforming an environment designed for learning into one optimized for killing. Every piece of furniture became a component in a larger machine, a machine designed to channel, control, and ultimately destroy a predator that had terrorized the galactic rim for millennia. "Clicks, I need you to understand something," Marcus said as he worked, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had moved beyond fear into pure tactical thinking. "Your species evolved on a world without large predators. You developed intelligence as a tool for cooperation and exploration. That's why your bodies are crystalline. You never needed to hide, run, or fight." The Zinthari student nodded slowly, his stress fractures beginning to stabilize as he focused on Marcus's words rather than their situation. "Humans evolved differently," Marcus continued, using a desk leg to pry apart sections of the wall paneling, exposing the maintenance tunnel entrance. "We developed intelligence as a weapon. Every advance in human technology, from fire to fusion reactors, has been about becoming better killers. We didn't reach for the stars to explore. We reached for them because we'd already conquered everything on our own planet." He gestured to the improvised defenses they'd constructed, barriers that would funnel an attacker into predetermined kill zones, weapons positioned for maximum effectiveness, escape routes that doubled as ambush points. To his classmates, it looked like chaos. To Marcus, it was as elegant as a mathematical proof. "The difference between human intelligence and galactic intelligence," he said, pulling a length of fiber optic cable from the wall, "is that we never forgot we were prey animals who became predators. You forgot you were prey at all." Professor Yith watched from her corner as Marcus began weaving the cable through the furniture, creating what looked like a complex web. "What are you building?" "A trap," he replied simply. "Void stalkers hunt by scent, electromagnetic signature, and vibration. They're patient stalkers who rely on stealth and surprise. But they have one weakness. They're adapted for hunting in zero gravity and vacuum. In atmosphere, with gravity, they're actually quite clumsy." He tied off the cable and tested its tension. "This will trip up something that masses about 800 pounds and moves on 6 legs. The moment it enters our kill zone, it becomes tangled. That gives us maybe 3 seconds to act before it adapts." "3 seconds?" gasped Vera, her gas-filled body pulsing with anxiety. "That's not enough time to." "It's enough time for a human," Marcus interrupted. "Humans can process threat assessment, target acquisition, and weapon deployment in under half a second. The rest of the time is for positioning and follow-through." As if summoned by his words, a new sound echoed through the station, the grinding screech of metal being carved apart with surgical precision. The Void Stalker had found the maintenance tunnel and was cutting through the barriers that separated it from their section. Marcus immediately moved to the tunnel entrance, pressing his ear against the exposed opening. The sounds were closer now, more distinct. He could hear the rhythmic scrape of claws against metal, the soft whisper of something large moving through confined spaces, and, underneath it all, a sound like controlled breathing, patient, methodical, intelligent. "It knows we're here," he said quietly. "And it's taking its time because it knows we can't escape." The classroom fell silent except for the sound of 30 beings trying to breathe quietly through emergency masks. Marcus could feel the weight of their fear, but also something else, a growing trust in his abilities that both honored and terrified him. These peaceful scholars were placing their lives in the hands of something they barely understood, a human being operating at full predatory efficiency. "Everyone take positions behind the barriers," Marcus ordered, his voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. "Stay low, stay quiet, and do exactly what I tell you when I tell you to do it." He moved to his own position, not behind the barriers with the others, but in the open space near the tunnel entrance. It looked like suicide to his classmates, but Marcus understood something about predator psychology that they didn't. The Void Stalker would expect prey to hide, to cower, to present the smallest possible target. It wouldn't expect prey to present itself openly, confidently, as if it were the hunter rather than the hunted. The grinding sound stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the station's emergency klaxons seemed muted. Marcus could feel his heart rate dropping into the steady rhythm his father had taught him, the calm pulse of a sniper waiting for the perfect shot. Around him, his classmates held their breath. Then came a sound that made several students whimper despite their breathing masks. The soft whisper of something massive sliding through the maintenance tunnel, getting closer with each passing second. Marcus adjusted his grip on the improvised spear he'd constructed from desk components, feeling the weight and balance of a weapon that would have been laughed at by any civilized species in the galaxy. But Marcus wasn't civilized, not in the way they understood it. He was human. A shadow moved across the tunnel opening, something too large for the space it occupied, defying physics in the way that only creatures evolved in impossible environments could manage. Marcus caught a glimpse of chitinous plating, multiple limbs that moved with predatory grace, and eyes that reflected the emergency lighting like polished obsidian. The Void Stalker emerged from the tunnel with the fluid motion of something that had never encountered effective resistance. It was everything the academic descriptions had suggested: 8 feet of perfectly evolved killing machine, with natural weapons that could shred titanium and reflexes that could track objects moving at relativistic speeds. Its 6 legs moved in perfect coordination, carrying a body designed by millions of years of evolution to be absolutely lethal. But evolution had played a trick on the Void Stalker. It had made it perfect for hunting species that had never learned to fight back. Marcus didn't move. He stood in the open, weapon ready but not threatening, presenting himself as prey that hadn't yet realized it was doomed. The creature's obsidian eyes fixed on him, and he could feel its predatory satisfaction like a cold wind against his skin. To the Void Stalker, this was just another easy meal, a soft-bodied biped that would provide minimal resistance and maximum nutrition. The creature took a step forward, then another, moving with the patient confidence of something that had never met effective resistance. Its electromagnetic senses were probably registering Marcus's elevated heart rate, his breathing pattern, the chemical signatures of adrenaline and fear, all normal prey responses. Except Marcus wasn't afraid. He was calculating. The Void Stalker's third step triggered the fiber optic cable trap. The nearly invisible strands caught around its forward legs, causing it to stumble slightly as it tried to maintain balance. For just an instant, the perfect predator was off balance, confused, vulnerable. Marcus moved. Human muscle fibers, evolved for persistence hunting across African savannas, delivered maximum power in minimum time. Human reflexes, sharpened by millions of years of needing to kill or be killed, guided the improvised spear with mathematical precision. Human intelligence, developed as a weapon rather than a tool, calculated the exact angle needed to penetrate chitinous armor and reach vital organs. The spear punched through the Void Stalker's thoracic plate with a sound like breaking glass. The creature's hunting scream became something else entirely, a sound of pain and disbelief that echoed through the station like a challenge to the natural order. Predators weren't supposed to be prey. Hunters weren't supposed to be hunted. But The Void Stalker wasn't dead. Pain and surprise had disrupted its attack, but millions of years of evolution don't die easily. It reared back, powerful limbs slashing at the space where Marcus had been standing. Claws that could carve through starship hulls whistled through empty air. Marcus was already moving, rolling behind the defensive barriers he'd constructed, grabbing the second spear he'd prepared. The creature's electromagnetic senses tracked him, but its movements were becoming erratic as injury and confusion disrupted its perfect predatory programming. Now, Marcus called to his classmates, and though his voice was calm, it carried absolute authority. Distraction protocol. The response was immediate and perfectly coordinated. Clicks triggered the classroom's holographic display system, filling the air with swirling patterns of light that would confuse electromagnetic senses. The Aryan students released their stored atmospheric pressure in sharp bursts that created conflicting sound patterns. Even Professor Yith contributed, secreting a cloud of bioluminescent mucus that added visual confusion to the sensory chaos. The Void Stalker spun in place, trying to track multiple targets simultaneously. Its perfect hunting senses, adapted for the clean electromagnetic environment of space, couldn't process the bombardment of conflicting signals. For a crucial few seconds, it was effectively blind and deaf. Marcus used those seconds to close distance and attack again. The second spear took the creature in what would have been its neck if it had possessed human anatomy. Dark fluid sprayed across the classroom walls, and the Void Stalker's movements became increasingly uncoordinated. But it was still fighting, still dangerous, still capable of killing everyone in the room if given the opportunity. Phase 2. Marcus called, diving behind another barrier as claws raked the air where he'd been standing. Containment and finishing. What followed was unlike anything in the academic records of galactic conflict. 30 young scholars, the brightest minds of their respective species, worked together with military precision to systematically destroy one of the galaxy's most feared predators. They used improvised weapons constructed from classroom furniture, tactics developed in real time by a human brain operating at full battlefield efficiency, and the combined intelligence of a dozen species focused on a single objective: survival. The Zenthari students used their precise motor control to deploy restraining cables at exactly the right moments. The Felinoids employed their natural agility to stay ahead of the creature's increasingly desperate attacks. Even the Aryans contributed, using their gas bag physiology to create pressure differentials that further disrupted the creature's senses. And at the center of it all was Marcus, moving through the chaos with lethal efficiency. He struck when the creature was distracted, retreated when it focused on him, and constantly adapted his tactics as the situation evolved. His classmates watched in fascination and terror as he demonstrated what human intelligence looked like when stripped of civilization's constraints. The end came suddenly. The Void Stalker, weakened by blood loss and sensory overload, made a final desperate lunge at the largest group of students. Marcus intercepted the attack with the third and final spear, driving it through the creature's central nervous cluster with surgical precision. The hunting scream cut off abruptly. 8 feet of perfect predator collapsed to the classroom floor, dark fluid pooling around its motionless form. The galaxy's most feared apex predator had been killed by a human using improvised weapons, and the coordinated efforts of species it would normally consider easy prey. The silence that followed was different from the terrified quiet of earlier. This was the silence of beings who had witnessed something that challenged their fundamental understanding of the universe. They had seen a human being operating at full capacity, and they finally understood why humanity's application to join the Galactic Consortium had been accompanied by so many warnings and restrictions. Marcus stood over the creature's corpse, still holding the improvised spear, his breathing steady and controlled. In the red glow of the emergency lighting, with alien blood on his hands and the body of a legendary predator at his feet, he looked like something from the darkest myths of a dozen civilizations. "Is it dead?" whispered Clicks, his crystalline body still showing stress fractures from the encounter. Marcus nodded, then knelt beside the corpse to check for vital signs. "Neural activity has ceased. Circulatory system has shut down. It's dead." He stood and looked around the classroom. At the improvised fortifications, the blood-stained walls, the terrified faces of beings who had just learned that their peaceful universe was far more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. "Now comes the hard part," he said quietly. "Harder than fighting a void stalker?" asked Tim, his voice shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. Marcus smiled, and for the first time since the crisis began, it was a warm, entirely human expression. "Now we have to explain to the authorities how a bunch of students killed something that's supposed to be unkillable. And we have to do it without starting a panic about human capabilities that could get my entire species banned from the galaxy." The implications of what they'd accomplished began to sink in. The galactic community believed that intelligence and civilization naturally led away from violence. They'd built their entire social structure on the assumption that sufficiently advanced species would transcend their predatory origins. The idea that humanity had become more dangerous, not less, as they developed technology and intelligence was antithetical to everything the galaxy believed about evolution and progress. But Professor Yith surprised them all by speaking up from her corner, her voice carrying a new note of respect and understanding. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "it's time the galaxy learned that there are different kinds of intelligence, different paths to advancement." She gestured to the classroom around them, the improvised weapons, the coordinated tactics, the dead predator that shouldn't have been killable. What we witnessed here today wasn't savage or primitive. It was a form of intelligence that we've never encountered before. Strategic, adaptive, perfectly suited to its environment. Marcus looked at her with surprise. "Professor, the human death world hypothesis suggests that your species developed intelligence as a survival tool in an environment of extreme danger," she continued, her academic mind already working to process what she'd witnessed. "We've always assumed that was a limitation, that violence-based intelligence was somehow inferior to peaceful development. But perhaps we were wrong." She moved closer to Marcus, studying him with the fascination of a scientist encountering a completely new form of life. "Perhaps the galaxy needs predators. Perhaps we've become so peaceful, so safe, that we've lost the ability to protect ourselves from things like void stalkers. Perhaps we need humans." The words hung in the air like a revelation. Around the classroom, beings from a dozen species began to understand that they hadn't just witnessed a fight. They'd witnessed the birth of a new relationship between humanity and the galaxy. Not as violent primitives seeking acceptance, but as necessary guardians of a civilization that had forgotten how to defend itself. Marcus felt the weight of that responsibility settling on his shoulders, and, for the first time since arriving at Nexus Academy, he didn't try to minimize his nature or apologize for what his species had become. Instead, he stood a little straighter, accepted the role that evolution and circumstance had given him. "Then, we better make sure they understand what they're asking for," he said quietly. "Because once humans start protecting something, we don't stop until the threat is completely eliminated." In the distance, they could hear the sound of security forces finally breaching the outer barriers, racing toward their location with weapons and equipment designed for containing diplomatic incidents rather than killing apex predators. Soon they would have to explain what had happened here, how 30 students had accomplished what an entire security force hadn't been able to manage. But, for now, in the red-lit silence of a classroom transformed into a battlefield, the survivors of humanity's first official contact with a galactic-level threat began to understand that their universe had just become a very different place. And, at the center of that transformation stood a young man from Earth, still holding his improvised spear, ready to face whatever challenges awaited his species among the stars.